I frequently see you referring to primary and secondary compensations. I must have missed the day at university where they defined these. Any chance you could define them in one of your videos? Not having any luck finding definitions elsewhere. Well, unless you went to the University of Big Z and colleagues, you probably wouldn't hear it at your university. So let me definition it for you. Primary compensation. When we're discussing that, this goes back to the anthropometrics discussion that we had with a few questions ago. With a narrow or a wide infrasternal angle, they have a structural bias about them that predisposes them to being limited with certain positions, movements, directions. In the case of the wide infrasternal angle, remember the forces are being directed anteriorly, sacrum's going to tip forward. I don't want to fall. So the first thing that they will do to prevent the fall is to concentrically bias the back side of their body to upright them. That is the primary compensation. The primary compensation is the first thing that this person does to manage their body structure. In addressing that compensation involves manipulating the dynamics of the structure in order to restore movement options. Let's suppose I'm that wide ISA. So I fell forward. Oh, crap. What's happening? Boom. Concentrically bias my backside. And now that's pulling me too far. Oh, crap. Now I'm falling backwards. What am I going to do? Well, in order to prevent the fall backwards, you then have to concentrically bias the front side of your body. I will have to use bigger musculature to upright in that case. Think of it this way. It's like the bias of falling forward is probably small enough that you can use the little guys on the backside, think your multifidus, rotatories, all that stuff, to upright. But now that I've created this gradient of I'm a little bit tighter on the back, less tight on the front, and I start getting pulled too far back, I probably got to use bigger dogs to upright me. I use an inner layer of musculature to upright me first, the primary compensation. The secondary compensation is the restrictions that manifest to upright from the primary compensation. In the wide case, they fell forward. Primary compensation was to concentrically bias the backside of the body. If that makes them fall too far backward, you're going to then do a secondary compensation, which would be to concentrically bias the front side of the body. For a narrow infrasternal angle, that's flip-flopped. For a narrow, they're falling backwards first because of the backward forces directed from the inhalation. So their primary compensation is to concentrically bias the front side of the body to upright themselves. But if I do that and now I'm falling too far forward, oh, snap, crackle, and I don't want to pop, then I'm going to concentrically bias the back side of the body to upright from that overcorrection. And that concentric bias on the backside is the secondary compensation. The primary addresses the structure. The secondary counteracts the primary compensation. And that's why we order it in that way. Is that how it actually happens? Probably not. It's likely the person's structure dictates where all the restrictions would be. But I think it is useful, and from a treatment standpoint, as we'll talk about later, effective to think of it in those terms. How do you know if a person has only primary compensations or if they have secondary compensations? Well, I'm glad you asked. This is where concentric back and concentric front are useful. Because if I have a concentric bias of the back side of the body, the posterior aspect, and when by body I mean the ventral cavity, this person will have limitations generally in flexion, abduction, and external rotation. If I have a concentric bias on the front side of the body, I'm going to have a limitation in extension, adduction, and internal rotation, ventral cavity. Now, let's look at our two archetypes, the narrow and the wide ISA. For the wide infrasternal angle, if they're concentrically biased on the back as their primary compensation, you're going to see limitations in flexion, abduction, and ER. Measures that should be clear are extension, adduction, and internal rotation. If you see someone who's a wide and they have a loss of extension, adduction, and IR, we don't have an unsolved mystery, people. We got a concentric bias on the front side and thus a secondary compensation. For the narrow, that completely flip-flops the other way. A narrow infrasternal angle, since their primary compensation is to be concentrically biased on the front, they should be limited in extension, abduction, and internal rotation. But if they're limited in flexion, abduction, and ER, then you know that they have secondary compensation at play. And that's how you can differentiate primary and secondary compensations.